Hi, good morning. My name is Lee McDarby. I am the Managing Director of Moneycorp's UK International Payments business. We are here today with a good friend of ours, Vicky Pryce, who is a renowned economist and business consultant. Just before I hand over to Vicky, I will give you a little bit of background about Moneycorp, just in case you don't know who Moneycorp are. Moneycorp move money. That's essentially what we do. We exist to make people's lives easier and easy for businesses when it comes to international payments. We've got great technology. We offer an extensive range of products. And most importantly, we've got a strong ethos of service and relationship running throughout our business. So whilst we've got a great platform for people and businesses to make or receive payments, our foundations are very much in bricks and mortar. And we've been around for 40 years, originally founded in Knightsbridge in central London. So without further ado, I will pass control over to Vicky as she talks us through post-lockdown performance.
Thank you very much. There is no doubt that the world has been becoming considerably pessimistic about the outlook for this year and possibly next year. This is the latest IMF, International Monetary Fund, forecast for 2020, which shows a very substantial decline in GDP for the world as a whole. And that, interestingly enough, is a huge, huge change from where we were just a few months ago. We are in unprecedented times, but just remember that at the end of January, when the IMF was already beginning to be a little bit more pessimistic, mainly because of concerns about international trade not really picking up. Remember the US-China disputes, which were slowing everything down. They had revised their forecast down to plus 3% growth for the world economy, which was bad enough. It only took them a couple of months to then revise it down to minus 3%. And just a few days ago, they've come now with the latest forecast, which is nearly minus 5% for the world economy, which is, of course, very worrying. There are inevitably some signs of recovery that we have already seen, but nevertheless, because the virus has spread all across the world and is now affecting countries which weren't affected that much earlier, what we've seen is that this has become a real global pandemic. And you can see the actual forecast here in slightly more detail. And the interesting thing is that, particularly if you compare this with what happened back in the financial crisis, at that time, the advanced economies all fell for a while, not very long, but what was going on in the developing world was that they were still doing okay for a couple of years in 2008, 2009 until 2010 or thereabouts, just when the advanced economies were recovering at the time. And those developed economies carried on growing, but the developing world started having all sorts of issues with low commodity prices and so on. And a number of countries, remember Russia, Brazil and so on, went into recession at the time. But the interesting thing is, although obviously we want all countries to be growing, it had balanced things out a bit. Whereas this time, everyone is seeing that decline. And that is why the IMF was as pessimistic as I showed earlier. And what we've got here is that they are particularly pessimistic about the advanced economies, where they forecast a fall of 8% this year, followed by just 4.8% recovery in 2021. Just a bit before that, everyone hoped that the bounce back in 2021 would have been quite significant. And therefore, we perhaps wouldn't worry too much about such a substantial drop this year. But it now looks like certainly the advanced economies will not have recovered their output next year. And it might take quite a lot longer for this to happen. What you can see here is the OECD expectations. Forecasts, of course, differ depending on which organization you look at. They're slightly less pessimistic about the world's fall that's going to take place this year. The OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. But what you see here is that there is a real concern about the type of recovery that we may have. What everyone is expecting is this collapse in output that we've already seen, of course, across the world. But this bounce back that we're all expecting to happen, even if there isn't a second wave, and the way that this chart is drawn, you can see the red dotted line, which on the worst forecast goes down again in terms of output growth, because we have a second spike towards the end of the year, and then you have a bit of a recovery taking place. But what you see is that if that were to happen, then we're still, going to be well below where we would have been if there was no spike, and hopefully there isn't going to be one. But even if there is no spike, what we end up with is a recovery and a growth which is sort of respectable, but from a very low base. But what we don't do is really go back to where we were back in November 2019. In other words, the growth trajectory is very different to what it would have been. Yes, you get the percentage increases, but you have lost a huge amount of output that is probably not going to be recovered in a hurry at all. So what have been the policy aims when countries have been trying to deal with this? I mean, obviously at the beginning, they had to do something about the virus, so they cut back. It was very interesting that this particular recession, again, if you're looking at it by comparison to what happened in the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, is that we tried this time to cut both supply and demand, whereas what we were doing back in during the financial crisis is encourage an awful lot of money into the economy so that people would go out and spend. Well, we're not doing that now because we basically encourage people to stay at home. In fact, force them to stay at home and close quite a lot of areas where they might have spent their money. So what then happened is this phase of beginning to grow, a recovery phase, avoiding a second wave of infections, of course, by only easing lockdowns quite gently. And of course, we know that in a number of countries, that's happening right now in Australia, but also in some of the Eastern European countries and in some cities in the West, such as here in Leicester, but also places in Germany and so on. What you're seeing is the occasional lockdown happening again, but overall there is an easing, and there is an easing which is happening at various stages. So airline traffic has finally begun to recover because travel had practically stopped, certainly between countries for a while. So that's the phase we're in at present. The question, of course, is mainly because one is worried about a second wave, but also in terms of what happens all across the other countries one is dealing with, whether that recovery phase will then lead to sustained growth. And as I showed earlier, there is a serious concern that despite the huge amounts of liquidity that have been put into the system by many countries, we're actually not going to get back to any serious growth. And there may well need to be more efforts at various stages which come in from the governments to sustain that recovery. We've seen a huge change in the role of the public sector. The state is getting much more involved in taking stakes in companies in many countries, huge amounts of state aid for failing businesses, which perhaps would have done fine else otherwise. That includes, of course, I mentioned airlines, the airline sector. He looked at the rescues of Lufthansa, Air France, KLM. Of course, Virgin Atlantic here has been trying to get some support, but for the moment it's trying to do it all itself. So there are big areas of concern, but that also includes quite a large part of manufacturing, where there's been a big hit because, of course, exports suffered, and particularly when China went into that early lockdown, that affected also supply chains very significantly, and exports of cars, which of course have affected Germany and others, including, of course, the UK. However, there are some reasons for being, or feeling certainly, slightly more optimistic than perhaps the earlier slides indicate, and that is that output is beginning to recover globally. Of course, you'd expect that to happen with the easing of lockdowns. So what we're seeing is that the global PMI, which is basically the Purchasing Managers Index, the one that looks at where we are right now in terms of orders coming through, and therefore they indicate a level of activity for firms, that one is recovering and is actually showing some growth. What is even more encouraging is that if you look at the future prospects for firms, the global future output composite actually indicates too that we are getting into positive territory. Anything above 50, remember, is indicating growth, expansion. Anything below is indicating contraction. And you can see from this slide where the June 2020 figure is, which is now clearly in growth territory. Worth bearing in mind that much of that is due to China. China came out of lockdown earlier than the rest of the world did, because of course they went into lockdown earlier as well. And what we've seen is output there recovering quite substantially, and this is the business confidence indicator. It's getting there, and the reason why the confidence indicator is slightly less, if you like, bullish than what's happening in China on the manufacturing front, for example, is because, of course, profits have been squeezed. And they've been squeezed, in fact, everywhere across the globe. Firms that have started producing also have huge debts that they have accumulated, and they probably need substantial restructuring. And for the moment, of course, prices cannot go up to make up for some of the lost revenue and the costs that have been incurred during the lockdown. If you look in Europe, again, a bit of good news. Things are getting better, but getting better from a very, very low base. But what we have seen is that retail sales in Germany, for example, have been quite high. Confidence seems to be improving more generally. Of course, it varies from country to country, and we've seen some problems again with the lockdowns resuming in some places. But overall, there is a change of mood, and it's got to be remembered that a very significant reason why this mood is changing has been because of huge injections of fiscal support from various governments, but also, of course, monetary support. In the Eurozone in particular, the European Central Bank has injected already, or at least agreed to inject 750 billion euros in the shape of quantitative easing, but also buying corporate bonds in the secondary market. And also, at the same time, there is huge discussion right now about a recovery fund, which hopefully will be agreed at some point. There's a lot of discussion about this in the sense that certainly the Southern European countries want a lot more of that to be in the form of grants rather than loans. But we're talking about a very substantial sum of money, which may well go for and assisting not just the healthcare issues of countries, but also financing quite a lot of longer term projects which lead to sustainable growth, hopefully in the future. Big change in mood in Europe, in that finally there is recognition that they all need to get together and assist each other, which we didn't actually see very much of at the time of the Eurozone crisis in the late 2000s and the early part of the last decade. However, despite those positive indicators, what is really worrying is that trade is not picking up to the extent that we would like it to be, and there are serious concerns as to what will happen. It's not just the question of the US-China dispute. There's also, of course, a US-Europe dispute, but it is really, very much an issue of countries not having quite recovered yet and doing it quite gently, and also, of course, quite a lot of concern about the reliability of the supply chains that existed before. There is a lot of discussion about inshoring, bringing back closer the supply chains that before seemed to operate even though they were at a huge distance. So there is a little bit of that that's going on in the World Trade Organization, which warned also that last year had very flat growth in trade. We might actually see this year a fall of anywhere between 13 and 33% in trade, and that's of course bad news for a place like the UK, which is going to be increasingly relying on open trade with lots of other countries after the transition period here is over with the EU. So for the UK in particular, which is also very relying on the service sector, what we've got is that the hit has been greater than had perhaps been seen in other countries, and is likely to be seen when the year is over. Of course, predictions are very difficult to make right now. Most organizations just put scenarios forward, and I showed some of those scenarios earlier in the slides, because we just don't know. And a large part of that depends on what happens in individual countries in relation to fiscal support, but a lot of it also depends on how businesses and consumers react to some of that support, but also to the opening up. There's still a lot of concern about health issues. People are reluctant to go out and spend. So there is an element of that enters this. But nevertheless, there is an issue, the fact that the UK is so dependent on services by comparison to others, and those are the areas that have been most affected by the pandemic, in the sense that all those sectors that are very customer facing have had a problem in terms of staying open or even keeping their people employed. So the OECD is forecasting that if there is a second crisis in terms of infections increasing again in the autumn in the UK, we may end up with something like 15% unemployment in the UK, and if not, perhaps 11%. And that explains also why we had on July the 8th jobs help given additional by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the overall package is something like 30 billion put into the economy, mostly to ensure that people who've been furloughed, those in other words that have had their wages paid for by the government, are not then let go and swell the unemployment ranks. And that perhaps will work, but it explains very much why the government felt they had to have emergency measures to support not only those workers who right now have been furloughed, but also the new workers who are coming into the market from schools and universities, and a lot of help for the under 25s. So in the UK, of course, the problem has been in many ways more acute than elsewhere. Very, very substantial fall in GDP in April, which was not expected to be quite so large. We never had a monthly fall like this. And of course, we had a fall at the end of the first quarter. March, so 5% decline, which together with April makes it a 25% decline. You've seen this chart that even at the worst time of the Great Recession, we didn't have falls of more than 1% per month. So this has been a shock. All the slides have had to be redrawn because the scales weren't quite right. And of course, that was at the time of the lockdown, and things have improved a little bit since. But many sectors have been very badly affected. And you can see here how. Interestingly, we talk a lot about the service sector, but manufacturing has also suffered quite significantly. We're hearing now, of course, that the aerospace and the car industry are in difficulty, and we've had the government with something called Project Birch here in the UK, intending to rescue a number of firms in the manufacturing sector, which otherwise would probably close down. We've had very large number of redundancies already announced in manufacturing and also in services, and that's going to be quite a hard job for anyone to turn it around unless trade and the other economies all recover quickly. The result has been that the government's injection into the economy has had to be bigger and bigger than what had been anticipated originally. It is quite extraordinary how everything suddenly that we thought before was impossible to do, such as borrowing these levels, is now possible. So we're likely to be borrowing 300 billion this year. At the time of the March 11 budget, we expected to borrow just 55, and that was quite high. It was already more than had been anticipated just a few months earlier because of the slowdown we're already seeing, because of concerns about coronavirus, but nothing like what we have to do now. And you can see in this slide the drop that is expected, of course, to be happening in GDP in the next, well, the quarter that just finished, and the recovery which they hope will happen in the third quarter. Well, I mean, it's very unlikely that this will seriously take place, but the overall fall in GDP this year is expected to be about 13% by the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is the organization which does the forecast and also looks at the fiscal side of government policies. So 300 billion borrowing. How have we been able to do it? The markets have been very prepared to lend. If you look at 10-year yields, they're at just 0.22% at the last time I looked. They may have moved a little bit since I did that. We had a period when 5-year yields were negative just a few weeks ago when the government borrowed in the markets. And with low yields, it is affordable. It seems that the markets are quite satisfied that we have a Bank of England behind us, prepared to buy quite a lot of those bonds in the secondary market, and quantitative easing by the Bank of England has already been 200 billion so far since the crisis started, and an extra 100 billion has been pledged. So interestingly, it's exactly the amount that we need to borrow, so the markets are satisfied that we can do it. And indeed, we've seen a bit of recovery as a result of all this huge injection of funds, and also guaranteeing of loans for businesses. So a bit of confidence has returned. And what we've seen is that the composite PMI index, which has services, manufacturing and construction in it, is now moving to almost positive territory. Within that, services still lingering a little bit behind, but manufacturing and construction doing reasonably well. One worry is, of course, when we get out of this crisis, what happens to the whole program of levelling up that the government had here in the UK. Remember, the manifesto for the last elections was in December, and everything that was said in the March 11 budget was all about spending a huge amount of infrastructure to improve the conditions in the rest of the country, whereas London and the South East have been receiving the bulk of any money in the past. Huge inequalities, of course, still exist. The worry is that we get out of the current crisis and those inequalities will be even bigger than before, as a number of areas in the UK have been badly hit. London has been able to continue functioning. Lots of services have managed, in fact, to have people work from home. Lots of manufacturing businesses have not been able to do that, obviously. And then you superimpose the concerns about Brexit and what the implications would be of lost trade as a result of that. And we know now the transition period will not be extended beyond December. Those are calculations of what would happen if we move to a no-deal scenario, which is still being rumoured, which of course will hit the regions hard. And the cost to the exchequer will be even bigger if those aims to level up are indeed maintained. So where are we? Well, to sum up, the world of economic activity is picking up. There's still a lot of uncertainty around, but there will be a bounce back. The question is how fast, and will it go back to where we were before, which in itself wasn't particularly fantastic anyway. Trade tensions continue, people still worried about health issues. There is a longer term concern, which has to do with, are we deglobalizing? Are we in fact going to take away quite a lot of the positives that we had through the decades of globalization that took place? It may happen up to a point anyway, and we may not be able to control that. What has been going on, of course, is that through this crisis, there's been a huge amount of extra borrowing, a lot of fiscal support, not just in the UK, but also everywhere else. And just to repeat, the huge amount that's been offered by the European countries anyway, and in the Eurozone with enormous support, but also here in the UK. But US, Japan have seen similar inputs to assist the economy. There's a lot of extra support, of course, for jobs. The Chancellor announced quite a lot more on the 8th of July with the extra 30 billion. Overall, there's been quite a lot of direct fiscal support. And when you look at what's happening to the economy and also what's happening to the fiscal side, because we're growing more slowly, obviously there's going to be fewer revenues in many areas. And if people don't spend enough, there won't be enough VAT, which is collected. And corporation tax will also suffer. So there's another 100 billion or so that isn't going to come to the exchequer, and therefore we need to add that to the 200 billion of direct fiscal support. That makes it 300 billion. Of course, there will be more. SMEs are going to need some extra help. Some big manufacturing companies, as I mentioned, will need some direct assistance. Problems with the auto sector, aerospace in particular, but loads of others. And Brexit, of course, still there, increase of costs, and that will be an issue. There are now discussions going on. There are still lots of stumbling blocks. And if you look at the city itself, the issue of equivalence, are we going to be able to have agreement that our own regulations can be accepted and will be accepted for the long term, so we don't have nasty shocks every now and then? And the main worry for the longer term is that we may, in fact, during this crisis, have lost a lot of productive capacity that is just not to come back. And that will mean a lower growth trajectory and lower prosperity and fewer jobs for the future, unless something gives. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Vicky. Very, very insightful as always. I really appreciate the effort that goes into producing the slides and the insight that you give for our clients. So I just thought we could move on to some questions right now. We've got a question from Annabella Chan, who runs a luxury jewellery brand based in London, and it's quite topical because she wants to get a little bit more information if you've got any thoughts on the measures, the employment measures that were put in place. Obviously, there's been a lot of business stimulus put through previous measures, but we saw the furlough job retention bonus and the Kickstart scheme for youth employment. So what's your take on the latest measures and how they may impact the business? And then some of the other measures in there as well, are they valid measures, or are they more of a gimmick? Just a bit more on that.
I think businesses were rightly worried about the end of the furlough scheme. Remember, that's finishing in October. From this month onwards, and we're having some changes anyway to the scheme, particularly pronounced, of course, September and October, when the percentage that the government pays into sort of wages of whoever is furloughed gets reduced. And there's been a serious worry that by the end of that period, and even before, because you do need to, particularly for big firms, have quite a period during which you give some notice of redundancy, that we may indeed see at the end of that period a very substantial increase in the number of people who are unemployed. And that is the worry, I think, for the government. And if there isn't anything to replace those jobs, I mean, we've seen a very substantial decline in vacancies as well in many sectors, then that will be a problem for the longer term. And of course, that will prevent the recovery from seriously taking hold. So from an economic viewpoint, it makes sense to continue the help. Now, whether the help that's been provided on the 8th is necessarily going to do the trick is a big question mark. And I'm sure a number of firms would be quite pleased that they can get something anyway. But from an economic viewpoint, there is a worry about the debt weight. In other words, quite a lot of firms probably were taking people back from furlough anyway, already beginning to do so this summer. Some already have gone back with the easing of the lockdown restrictions. So are firms going to just take advantage of this and get this extra money that in many ways perhaps they don't necessarily need? But frankly, there's been such a huge increase in costs for businesses staying closed, and all the extra efforts they had to make the premises safe, that perhaps we shouldn't worry about that. There's always dead weight, as reported in Economist, problems with any sort of measure. But frankly, right now, because this has been such an unprecedented crisis, throwing money into the economy in any way or form is actually a good idea, and see what sticks. So, but it's not as good, of course, for firms as the extension of the furlough scheme itself, particularly in areas which haven't really been able to open properly. And what we really need to be worrying, perhaps for SMEs in particular, more than anything else, is what to do more generally about their costs and any loans they may have had to take during that period. Can there be any more help that is available there? And I think that's what matters most.
I think that leads us very nicely into a question that came from one of our senior dealers, Chris Redfern, and you also touched on it on your slide where you referred to huge support packages for the UK. The question is, have the government got themselves in too deep with everything, and how do you envisage that they're going to be able to repay the stimulus that's been put into the economy? Obviously, that's quite a big question, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, yes. I mean, just a few months ago, we would worry, and we worried about the 55 billion that they were going to be borrowing during this year, which wasn't really expected. And now we're talking about 300 billion.
Drop in the ocean.
Well, absolutely. Well, in reality, as I said, I mean, the costs are not that great. Even from before, despite the fact that since the financial crisis, our debt had trebled by the time we hit this new crisis, we were paying very little more in terms of servicing that debt than we were before the financial crisis itself. So when it was just a third of the size that it was at the beginning of this financial crisis. So from that point of view, we don't need to worry fantastically. And as long as interest rates stay low, then the extra cost is bearable, certainly. And the reason why we've been able to continue to borrow is, of course, as I said earlier, we borrowed quite easily, is because there is a central bank behind with the ability to come in and assist. Because everyone knows they can buy those bonds, and there is somebody willing there to buy them off you if you want to. And they can come in with more if necessary. And the UK is not going to be among the countries that default. But we've had the credit rating already reduced at the beginning of this crisis. So around March time, we've had a lowering in our credit rating as well when we voted to leave the EU back in 2016. And of course, we had one in the financial crisis back in 2008-9. So we've had those great ratings, and nevertheless, we've been able to borrow quite cheaply. And the average maturity is quite long. So I think we'll be okay. But there is no doubt in my mind that at some point, the Treasury bean counters are going to take over. And there will be a look again at some of the tax increases that may happen. Government departments have already been asked, apparently, each of them to look at 30% savings, because there's going to be a spending review which is taking place right now. We'll hear more about that in the autumn. And quite a lot of those big infrastructure projects, that's why I showed the difficulties that there may be in regions. Quite a lot of those which had been promised. Remember, there was a 500 to 600 billion spending that was meant to happen over the course of the Parliament to ensure we had better equalization across various regions. Well, some of those may be cut, so we may not get them. And some of the big trophy projects, HS2 perhaps, in terms of its full glory, may not happen as we expected, and loads of other things. So the emphasis is on shovel-ready ones, it seems, right now, that we're going to get. So I think there will be a look again at what is sustainable for the longer term. But we have passed the point where, the focus was so much on, not increasing the debt to GDP ratio because nobody would lend to us. It seems that we can. But of course, if we get growth, that's going to be easier. And if we get inflation, that's going to be easier in terms of dealing with the debt.
Okay, lots to think about. Our head of sales at Moneycorp, Guy Phelan, he's been asked quite a few times by clients recently about the implication of a vaccine on the markets, but I guess that's probably a broader question which touches on one of your slides in terms of what do we think the shape of recovery will be. So obviously letters such as L, the dreaded L, have been bandied around, as well as a glorious V, both of which are probably unlikely, a W. And on your slides itself, there was more of a swoosh on there, so not necessarily a letter or kind of a wonky W. So what's your take on what could influence the shape of the recovery, and your gut feel about what that recovery will look like?
Well, if there is a second spike, then definitely W. But even if there isn't, there's been so much of the economy that has been sustained by government support, and not just the fiscal, but also and the monetary side as well, in terms of loans and guarantees to those loans and etc. That if that comes to an end, then we could have a bit of a W anyway. So a bit of a slowdown taking place. And that is, I think, why we've had this jobs package now, in order for that slowdown to be postponed to a bit later. So we see what's actually happening in the underlying economy, what's happening internationally as well. So that whatever other measures are needed, at least are taken on the basis of what we've seen is going on elsewhere. And during that period, at least people still have some money, and also they're encouraged to go out and spend the money that they've saved, and firms still keep them. And in the longer term, it's probably cheaper than having everyone on unemployment benefits anyway. So I think there's a lot that we can question about where we might go from the autumn onwards, and whether this W may materialize anyway, despite all the efforts that are there now. But I mean, a vaccine is crucial. Either that or a very effective treatment. When you know that, if you get that, you can take a couple of aspirins and you're fine, or something similar. And that isn't in prospect very short term, but it might be. And if that were to happen, and people are convinced that this would work, then we could have a much sharper V than would otherwise have been the case. But there's still going to be the problem of loads of firms having lost so much money, being supported by the government. Will they ever be able to come back again, or will something new happen to take their place?
A question from Toby Woodward, who heads up our corporate partnerships business. It's a multi-layered question, but at the core of it is essentially Brexit, and Brexit now that we have coronavirus to deal with as well. So, what has COVID impacted our negotiation stance? What are the realistic chances of a deal, and are we in a position to handle a hard Brexit? And also, how much worse could the recession be once you put all these different things in the mix?
Well, we're not in a position to handle hard Brexit. If I pick one of those bits of the question, up because companies are not prepared, and they've been doing an awful lot to survive this current crisis, that anything you add additionally in terms of costs is going to be negative for them. So again, if you're looking at the type of recovery we can have, I can only imagine that if there is no deal, no real agreement, then that recovery will be slower than it would otherwise be. And the real concern about the Brexit impact is that although COVID may be short term, and maybe, even though I think, as I said, we may have lost a lot of firms and a lot of productive capacity, which may not be made up in a hurry, the Brexit impact is considerably longer lasting. And any negotiations we may have, or trade agreements with the types of Australia, for example, or New Zealand, or perhaps with other countries which at present we deal with on WTO terms, or of course the US, are not going to make up for the loss of trade that we're going to be having with the EU, particularly in services. So in terms of the negotiations and what they're doing, what they've done, there is, politically the discussion that, well, because we are suffering so much now, we could do Brexit easily, even no deal, and nobody will really notice. But as I said, the Brexit issues are longer term, and we will notice them. Might not notice them immediately, particularly as we don't intend to change things too much at the beginning of the new phase we're going to be entering from the beginning of 2021, as we've heard, in terms of checks and so on. See if that actually happens. But there is, I think, a belief that because there is negotiation fatigue in Europe, after all, they've got their own problems to deal with, they may just agree to perhaps step back from some of their demands, and maybe things will be easier for us to get that agreement. Well, I don't think there's much basis for that. However, we have just heard that on the fishing side, which is one that has worried the UK a lot, and where actually the UK is in a stronger position than Europe, the Europeans are prepared to make concessions as to how we calculate how much fish can be fished in our waters. But we still have discussions right now in areas such as the financial sector, the whole equivalence issue that I mentioned, is one which is being negotiated at present, and where actually the UK is a complete supplicant, and Europe does not seem, or had not seemed, to want to budge on that. And negotiations last week finished early, they're resuming now, and it doesn't look like a huge amount of progress has been made, or is likely to be made this week. We may have to wait for that one until a bit later, and given that this is a parallel discussion with the free trade agreement discussions, it may actually last for a while before the end of the year. We may not know the answer until the autumn.
It's interesting to see the date go by past which Brexit can't be extended with a whimper. There was very little fanfare, there was very little reaction in the market. So one way or the other, we know something's coming down the line by the end of this year, and hopefully our coronavirus issues will be not as big by then, to give us a better ability to deal with it. Also on the housing market yesterday, what the announcement on stamp duty, what do you think that will have on the housing market? Is it going to have a material impact, or is it more of a statement to try and make people feel a bit happier?
It might do. I mean, the real problem had been that transactions had declined very substantially, had fallen very substantially during lockdown. Of course, one wasn't allowed to do them anyway. So what we've seen is quite a large increase in interest in buying a house, and inquiries from estate agents have increased very substantially in June. So the market is sort of picking up. Nevertheless, prices are not picking up. They haven't fallen as much as people expected, because I think sellers have stuck to their demands themselves. But who knows what will happen now with the reduction in stamp duty, which is again temporary, of course, and it affects houses of below 500,000. So it's worth bearing in mind that we will have a different impact depending on which part of the UK you're in, and it will probably be particularly beneficial for Londoners, because the prices are higher here, and the average price in London is just under 500,000 as it happens. So the average benefit in London may well be 15,000, whereas elsewhere in the UK maybe a lot less, where the average price is just 230,000, and where actually there were already exemptions from stamp duty up to 125,000. So it should encourage a bit of movement. The way that the Chancellor has described it is more that you move, and of course it improves confidence, but generally you do also all sorts of new DIY in your house, or you hire people to do various things for you, and therefore it circulates, money circulates, and there's a multiplier effect. Well, I think that's minimal, frankly. What I think we needed much more is a lot of support for house building, really. That's the one that has the biggest multiplier, and the reason why prices have been rather high in various places, because we haven't built enough. So, but it may help in terms of confidence if people feel that they're wealthier as a result, somehow or other. The wealth effect is quite important in consumer decisions. They may go out and spend some more, who knows, in other areas.
And just on risk events that we've seen this year, so obviously we've discussed the main two so far, which are coronavirus, which we're still living in, and Brexit, which is coming down the line. I guess that the third big one is the US elections. What are your thoughts on what's going to happen over in the States, given that they're obviously struggling also to deal with the impacts of the coronavirus and going into local lockdowns?
Well, it's a very important part of the whole sort of jigsaw puzzle that we're going to have. I mean, the real question is whether the attitude towards deglobalization and towards China and the trade effect are going to linger on. There isn't any huge indication that if Donald Trump loses and Biden wins, the US-China relationship will improve in any way. And therefore, what it will mean for the rest of the world. But of course, we're all looking at what happens in the US in terms of growth, but also its position internationally, their withdrawal from the World Health Organization, and also, their disinclination to support trade disputes by not really cooperating with the WTO either, is a big issue. So one hopes for a change in the attitudes. Whether a change of president will do that, I don't know.
Aside from those events, is there anything else that people should be keeping their eye on in terms of risk events between now and the end of the year? Things that may be happening around Europe politically?
I think what's going on right now is it may change, but it's an increase in nationalism. Yes, we've seen the Eurozone finally getting together in terms of financial support for some of the countries, but we are in many ways politically seeing that countries are drawing apart. A lot more concern about supporting their own borders, if you like, supporting their own areas, a lot more concern about producing more stuff in-house, if you like. There will have to be a rethink of supply chains, which might affect lots of firms, negatively, but some positively. I mean, there is all that. There is the issue of climate change, of course, that's still there. Some areas, some regions are perhaps looking to use the advantage, turn a crisis into an advantage by taking a lot of measures in parallel with supporting the economy that perhaps push their sort of sectors into much more sort of green areas of growth. After all, the EU in its recovery fund is one of the areas that we're going to focus on green and more environmentally friendly production as its core, and we'll be deciding how to spread that money based partly on that type of decision. So we're looking at the longer term growth potential, where obviously new industries, new sectors are going to have to be encouraged. So the question, I think, for the UK is whether in that environment we will also have the types of policies at some point which are more strategic and look at the long-term sustainability of of the economy. And if we don't, then perhaps we will lose out. I haven't touched on the whole IT revolution. I mean, finally, we've seen how useful IT perhaps can be. We're doing it right now. Exactly. Exactly. And also changes in work practices. Who knows what will happen there? I have some concerns about what happened to the commercial property sector if these trends continue. And on the other hand, we may find, like tomorrow, once the vaccine's there, that everyone gets back on the tube and wants to work back in the office. Well, I think probably we'll end up with a hybrid system where a lot more is done at home. And I found it very interesting that Germany is legislating to have it as a right for individuals to work from home, where they're properly employed back in home.
We're way into the point now where habits are created in terms of how people have been dealing with this for the last quarter. So it'd be interesting to see the reaction as we do start getting back to reoccupation and whatever the new normal brings us. And one final question. So I won't hold you to this because I appreciate you don't have a crystal ball. But what's your view on the currency markets for the rest of the year and beyond, sort of specifically relating to sterling, US, euro, the US dollar, the euro? Looking at the Bloomberg average forecasts, they suggest that the banks that they poll suggest that sterling will grind gradually higher over the course of this year and into 2021. But given the potential curveballs to be thrown at us, it's definitely difficult to pin your hat on that one. But what are your thoughts on forecasts for the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, it's a very interesting question, of course, and a very difficult one, as you said, to get right anyway. So I'm just going to guess now. I mean, the one important thing that affects the currencies is really the interest rate differential, first of all. And we are at 0.1% on the base rate. There have been discussions about possibly moving to negative interest rate. If we were to do that, then sterling would be affected. So you don't know whether that's going to happen, what would happen to other economies. So everyone has very low interest rates at present. So the differential isn't that great. So there isn't really one thing to decide against another. I think actually, if anything, I would be pushing sterling down in my mind because of the Brexit impact, because of the fact that so far, everything that's happened in terms of stimulating the economy has been short-term, without anything seriously strategic that suggests that we may be growing fast in the future. So we would probably, if you add the concerns about trade, be downgraded in terms of what growth we might be able to achieve. And I would imagine, therefore, that sterling will, if anything, be under pressure, some pressure. Not huge, but some pressure.
Thank you, Vicky. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you as always, and thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.